Hello and welcome. I'm Kim Marks, and you are attending a Target Archetypes 101. This is the introductory class on archetypes where we learn about what archetypes are, their history, and how we can use them. And we're also going to learn about the 4 survival archetypes. Just to let you know, let's start with the history of archetypes. Archetypes have been around since the dawn of humanity. The first archetypes undoubtedly showed up were the mother, the father, and the child. They are represented in myth and stories everywhere you look, especially in ancient history where we use story to talk and to convey meaning and to convey lessons learned. More recently, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, developed how we use archetypes in our lives and how they actually go into the collective unconscious and how we all use those same archetypes and how they symbolically stand for us. Joseph Campbell was another psychologist that worked on those with him. If you've ever heard of the Briggs-Meyer personality testing that you might have had in some job you've had, Briggs-Meyer bases their archetype testing on archetypes, and they call it personality. And then you can be the learner or the teacher or the director, but those are still all archetypes. Where you're going to find archetypes is about anywhere you look. Anytime you have interactions with other people, you'll see archetypes. When you start looking for archetypes, you'll find them in fairy tales, in books, in movies, and TV shows. A really good source, if you like to listen to audio or her books, is Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She wrote Running with the Wolves and other books that are about mythology and story. When she reads her work, it's just really awesome and it clarifies way more when you hear a fairy tale. It makes you understand it in another level. Another place that I have been recently enjoying is I like PBS and I have been watching Downton Abbey, which is now finished, and then I started watching Indian Summers, and those have a lot of clear archetypes. There's a lot of drama in those shows. So if you like PBS, check those 2 shows out. You can also find them on Amazon. So we need to think about what is an archetype. Archetypes are a universal pattern of energy They're an independent force of consciousness. It's a neutral pattern of energy. So it doesn't have, if it's good or bad, or it doesn't have that it only pertains to men or women, although archetypes can have a feminine or a masculine energy to them. They can be in a man or a woman either way. As you know, both men and women have feminine and masculine energy in their bodies. We can think of archetypes as they have a light side, which we might call a positive side. I like to use the word light because it takes less judgment on it. But that is an archetype in the light is when it is at its highest potential. A archetype that's in the shadow or the negative side, it is in the lowest energy that it can show. An archetype is really a route to power. So patterns we often use archetypes for are to know ourselves, to understand the world around us, to interact with our outside world and our internal world. There's an archetype for every facet of life. And what can archetypes actually do for us to help us? Well, they provide a path of personal empowerment, direction, self-knowledge. They answer the questions why I am, who I am, and why I do what I do. Archetypes demonstrate for us how we can use and distribute our personal power, can improve our awareness of ourselves and the efforts of our actions. Archetypes help us make wise choices and give us a path of direction and self-knowledge. In the shadow side, you're going to find that archetypes will keep you showing lack of direction. You'll have a more of a repression of your unconscious feelings that you don't want to deal with, instead of allowing those to come and surface and be neutralized. You have more destruction in your life. You feel like you have lack of choice, that you're unempowered, and you really feel like you're a victim of fate, which is things happening to you. Whereas in the light side of an archetype, you're going to get informed about universal truths, higher levels of perceptions. You start finding rituals that give structure to our power. You awaken your own divine potential, and that guides you to your highest place, which is destiny, and that is a life lived consciously and with choice. So archetypes can be very valuable for us if we understand them, because they show up as a symbolic meaning for us, which is why you know what an archetype is, even if you don't consciously. As soon as you meet someone, you meet the salesman, you know they're a salesman, even if they don't tell you their job, even if they don't sell anything, but they can still sell you something, even though it's not what their purpose is. It's that energy. You know a teacher when someone just teaches you. You just know that energy. So they're symbolic, but we want to now start to learn them consciously. So let's meet the first 4 archetypes that come into our lives, which are the survivor archetypes. Our basic survival archetypes are the child, the prostitute, the saboteur, and the victim. I have here the Wizard of Oz showing, because in your book, you'll see in Sacred Contracts, she kind of refers to the Wizard of Oz, because Dorothy's journey in the Wizard of Oz is a hero's journey where she faces her archetypes and learns to stand strong. So all of the characters actually symbolize parts of Dorothy's personality and her way of being in the movie. And most of us have seen The Wizard of Oz. So when you are first born, these are the 4 archetypes that show up. You need these archetypes because you need to know how to survive in the world. They share in common, they all have how they resonate with your own power. And they also work as a team, and they work individually. They help you find security and safety in the world. They're also a great challenge for us because they're how we learn our self-esteem. And if you have not brought these 4 archetypes to the light from fate, you'll never reach your destiny, and they will often sabotage you, put you under, and keep you in dark places instead of in the light. So you really need to learn about these 4 survival archetypes and start using them in the higher light potential, so that you're not taken by surprise and you make a life of conscious choice. And you're not relinquishing your powers to others so that you can be safe, which is another way of dealing with fate. So the moment you're afraid of something, you go into one of these 4 archetypes, or you can go into all 4 of them at once, since they are a team. These 4 archetypes influence the health of the rest of the archetypes you have in your particular patterns and wheels. It's like if you had 12 children and these were the oldest, they're going to have the biggest voice, they're going to get the most attention, and they're going to influence the other children. So in the system archetypes we're learning about, we have 12 archetypes. We're going to end up putting them in what's called a wheel. It's going to be called your chart of origin. These 4 will always be in everybody's wheel. You'll have 8 other archetypes that you are going to choose later on in the course, and we'll get them all in the wheel by the end. So the child archetype is about responsibility. The prostitute is about negotiating for safety. The saboteur is about your will. And the victim is really about boundaries. So the child archetype, as you can see, there's numerous types of children in this picture. There's numerous types of child archetypes. Everybody has a child archetype, but the child can then be subdivided down into other categories, like a magical child, a divine child, perfect child, the nature's child. There's numerous different kinds of children. And that's what this picture is representing, because we're going to learn about the children and you're going to figure out which one is predominant in your life. And when we're doing this chart of origin and we're looking at archetypes, we're looking for archetypes that were predominant before we turned age 20. Because you can be using different archetypes now when you're older than 20, but these predominant ones are still operating no matter what you do. So here we have a picture of Dorothy, because Dorothy's the child of the child archetype in The Wizard of Oz. She's the guardian of innocence. And really, besides learning responsibility, that is what your child does. It guards your innocence. It keeps things fresh. It keeps your perspective fresh. If you have a wounded child, it may not be as fresh, but the purpose of the child is to keep that wonder in your life and to teach you about responsibility. Today, we're not going to go into the other types of children, because next class we're going to do that, so that will help you pick out what child archetype you have, but just get the idea of a child in you that's guarding your innocence and teaching you about responsibility. That's what you want to take away from this class. Let's go to the victim. Here we have the cowardly lion who didn't believe he had courage. And he would be scared at everything and jumping in the movie. He never understood that he had courage. It was all within himself. He didn't know that he could make boundaries. But really, once you learn to be the victim in the light, you realize that you are guarding your self-esteem and you're taking care of your own self-esteem. We all would like to have the victim in the light. Unfortunately, in our society, the victim is often showing up in everything. Everybody is a victim of everything. In the larger sense of the world, though, it's all about your own personal responsibility, and that's also in it's your own responsibility, but it's also symbolically for your own responsibility. Because when you're in the light of the victim, you see where your part of everything is. How do you know if you're in the victim in the dark, in the shadow? Well, if you have no boundaries, that would be one indication. By having no boundaries, you keep your soul inside of you. And it doesn't keep you healthy, because you're just keeping things out. You're not keeping things out. Oftentimes in our families, boundaries are missing, or maybe in our tribe or our local groups that we're in. There's often no boundaries, and we need them because life is painful with no boundaries. By having boundaries and taking care of your own self-esteem, you keep your voice clear. And you know, when you set a boundary, your world will change, because things happen differently when you think different about yourself. Here's another way of knowing that you might be in victim mentality: is you judge someone because they threaten your survival. So let's look at the victim card. You'll have these cards in your deck. Here is the card with the victim telling you about the light, which is preventing you from letting yourself be victimized or victimizing others. The shadow is playing the victim for positive feedback in the form of pity or inability to maintain personal boundaries. What you want to think about when you're going from the shadow to the light of the victim is that you're victorious and strong and you believe in yourself. And one of the best questions you can ask yourself is it worth it to give up your own sense of empowerment to avoid taking responsibility for your independence? That's a good question to ask yourself when you are feeling victimized or being a victim, because responsibility is what gives you freedom. So let me just give you a few examples of what a victim might be doing. Say you're driving a car somewhere and someone just cuts in front of you and you get frightened. The first thing you do is you swear at them and call them a bad driver, or maybe you flip them off. Sometimes when you get a cold, the first question is, who gave me that cold? We don't think about whether we washed our hands. We don't think about whether we were nurturing ourselves. We didn't think about our immune system and taking care of it. We're just like, who gave me that cold? Where'd it come from? And then you kind of track down, well, I wasn't around anyone sick. Well, maybe so and so. That's a form of being a victim. It's slight, but it's still a form. Or maybe you can't find something in the house and you blame the dog for stealing it, your kid for hiding it, your spouse or your partner for not putting it away. That's another form of being a victim. And if you ever watch Modern Family, the character of Mitchell, he's often acting out like he's the victim. So remember, we want to learn to be the light side of the victim. That is our goal with these survival archetypes. And when we see our part in whatever, we acknowledge our own emotions and we face our own fears, we improve our self-esteem and we strengthen the victim. The other thing that you might really, the first thing you'll notice about a victim is almost always is blame. So if you hear blame coming from someone, you know that you've probably just seen the victim coming out. Here is a really cute video by Brene Brown on blame. I'm going to try and play it. Sometimes on the recording it doesn't come through clearly. If it doesn't come through clearly, please go ahead and skip this section and move on to the next slide. And at the very end, I will put in a link and it'll take you, when you're finished with the class, you can watch it again. So it just depends on your internet connection to whether it's going to work or not. So let's turn on Brene Brown on blame.
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this was a couple of years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who's my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back up at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of the story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the no thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we spend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
That was Brene Brown on blame. And if you think about it, all of us probably at some point immediately go to whose fault about everything, even when you are listening to someone else. Who did that to you? Why is it their fault? Instead of just feeling it and realizing your own responsibility in it. So let's move on to our next archetype. We are moving on to the Tin Man, the prostitute, the guardian of faith. The prostitute, when you talk about the prostitute, that really gets people interest up, because they're like, what is the prostitute? Why do I have the prostitutes? Well, think about the Tin Man. There he stands with his oil can, and he'll do anything for someone to give him some oil. And because he's squeaky, and he's helpless if someone doesn't do it. Well, a prostitute uses their body in the traditional sense and sells it for either personal gain or personal safety. We're not talking about prostitutes that were forced into prostitution. That's a different subject. So when we're thinking of a prostitute, we are symbolically thinking, what's my price? What's my price to keep me safe? The prostitute is learning about faith. How to have faith that things are going to turn out well for you. When the prostitute is thinking more about earthly and material things than they are about divine things that are going to keep you safe and that you know it, the prostitute will come up. The prostitute will come up because you have a belief that there isn't anything going to save you unless you don't take the pay raise. You trade off something you needed or wanted for something else that you need and want. It's all about security. It's about not knowing what's going to happen, because fate, you know what's going to happen with fate. So it's another case where you're not believing in yourself. When you become more empowered, you're going to start seeing the parts of you that you sell off, maybe even selling your soul for safety. And you keep getting tempted along the way just to see how your faith is, just sort of like Job did, but not quite as intense maybe. Here's some ways you're going to maybe do it. You're going to sell off your wisdom, your silence, your creativity, your opinions. You're going to compromise your integrity. And it might work with your friends and your jobs. You could have losses with these things. This is why you might sell out. You're afraid a relationship's going to be gone. You're afraid you're not going to get your pension. You're afraid you're not going to get your degree. Whatever it is you're afraid you're not going to get if you go against your belief. And sell yourself for safety. Think of Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. She was a prostitute in the show, but she also believed in herself that she was going to get more, that other things were going to happen for her. So here's the card, the prostitute. As it says, the light attribute is accentuating the challenge of surviving without negotiating the power of your spirit, versus the shadow attribute, which is placing material considerations and security above self-empowerment. So here's another example of a prostitute. Think of Cinderella. Her parents died, so she's an orphan. She's living with her stepmother and stepsisters. And in order to stay there, she has to perform ridiculous amounts of labor that's unreasonable. Does it occur to Cinderella ever to run away? We don't see that she ever thinks about running away. She just stays locked in there, one, waiting for someone to save her, and two, she's not in her own power. I'll have you note, though, that while she's not in her own power, she isn't being the victim. You don't hear her complaining. You don't hear her berating. Cinderella is still in herself. So she's still able to be part of herself, but not enough for safety. So that's just a thought about Cinderella. Your prostitute will show up when you're asked to do something that you don't want to, and you go ahead and say yes because you're afraid someone won't like you or be angry with you. It'll be when you don't speak up to ask for a raise. You don't speak up when you know you should have said something because you're going to lose something. That's when your prostitute comes up. Remember, in the light, your prostitute's going to bring you power of spirit. It's going to bring you faith. It's going to show up in things like maybe you got lost and you have faith that you're either going to find your way out or something's going to happen and you make it out safely versus you fall apart and you don't make it out safely. Think maybe you're lost in the woods, lost in a city, wherever. Maybe your car breaks down on the side of the road on a dark, snowy night. And someone stops and offers to help you. You've always been told not to take help, but you're desperate. But you have faith that that person isn't going to harm you. They're actually going to help you. Or maybe you're going for a job interview. And for some unknown reason, you're late. Something you couldn't do anything about. You have faith that they're still going to interview you and they're still going to give you a chance. That's the light side. In the dark side of the prostitute, you either wouldn't even go, you would show up and you would do anything to get the job. Example of that would be Will Smith in the movie In the Pursuit of Happiness. So remember, the prostitute is your guardian of faith, and she's asking what's the price to have what you want versus your own self-empowerment. She's a very strong person in our core survival archetypes. Well, let's move on to the scarecrow. The saboteur is our guardian of choice and represents our will. So you're learning how to make choices with your saboteur. Remember the scarecrow, the birds would chew him up and he would set himself on fire and he always had to have someone else's opinion. He didn't really believe in his own power. And he also didn't believe that he had a choice. So think about the saboteur as when you're afraid of the consequences of becoming powerful, because you know that's going to change your world. Think about the saboteur when you're getting guidance, like internal guidance, a knowing that just comes into you. Do you say yes and go about doing it? Or do you say no, and then you say you don't know what to do, and you go on and you can't do it? Saboteur is that little nagging voice inside your head that tells you to do something. The one that says you should do this. Do this, do this. Let's try to get the shit out. Go to that thing. Go to that meeting. Help that person. But you don't do it in the dark and you do it in the light. So the saboteur is really the mirror that reflects your fears of taking responsibility for yourself. And we most often see it in disruption because when the saboteur is making good choices, our life is going around really well and we don't really think of it at all because it's going well. We only seem to think about it when it's not going well. So here's the saboteur card, the light attribute, highlighting your fear of self-empowerment and the changes it would bring to your life. And the shadow attribute is inducing self-destructive behavior or the desire to undermine others, which I did not bring up yet about undermining others. But your saboteur will ruin others in the same way because of the self-empowerment. When you start to undermine others, you feel like you're powerful. You're not really powerful, but you feel like it. So every time we knock somebody else, if we're prejudiced about someone, that's our saboteur trying to undermine people. The saboteur in the shadow is going to show up when you lie to yourself, when you live off psychic stimulation or drama. It's going to show up when you're asked to do something because someone thinks you're great at it and you say you can't because you don't believe you can. It happens when you know that you're judging someone because you've been fighting or arguing with someone and you're judging them. And somewhere inside of you, you hear, don't judge that person. Just go ahead and judge them anyway. Think about Meryl Streep and Sophie's Choice. First, she had to make the choice, which the saboteur makes it, about which child to leave behind, or none at all, or herself, who to choose. Then, as the movie progresses on and she lives later, she's safe, but she's living with a brutal man after the war. Those are her saboteur making the choices. Some little simple saboteur choices are maybe you're invited to an event and you don't really want to go, and you don't just say, no thank you, or I can't go that night, or I don't even want to. You don't even say any of that, but you come down with a headache and you have to stay home from your headache. Or when you set up someone and you know they're going to fail, or you don't validate them when they did something because it would make them feel powerful. Those are some shadow sides of the saboteur. So one of the things you want to do with the saboteur, because it is about your will and it is about your choice, is you want to learn to be honest with yourself and find the real reasons for why you do whatever you're doing. That can show up in strange ways. Think about when you were 10, your mother always criticized how well you cleaned your room and always called you messy. So now you're an adult and you're tired and you're trying to make dinner and the kitchen's a mess, and then someone talks to you and you just snap at them. You're thinking it's because you're tired and you're having to work in the messy kitchen, but really it's that shadow memory coming up that gets provoked. And let's think about Cinderella again. Here's where her saboteur might have showed up. So Cinderella has to run away from the ball because she has to be done at midnight. So she runs away and she leaves that glass slipper. That's a saboteur. The choice was not to go back and get the slipper. And it's also a little bit of the prostitute, but think about that was a choice, another choice she made. It worked out well for her. I don't know why it decided it was going to do that screen sharing, message, but that's what that Bing is. It's the system telling me that it's either stopped or started the screen sharing. So let's go and think about these archetypes one more time. And I'm going to also give you a little bit other way to think about them. So remember, archetypes are universal forms of energy that we use to symbolically express ourselves. Everybody has the 4 survival archetypes: the child, the guardian of innocence, the victim, the guardian of self-esteem, the saboteur, the guardian of choice, the prostitute, the guardian of faith. We all have one predominant child archetype. Those 4 archetypes are what we learned to survive with when we first came into the world, and they still work for survival. There are older archetypes in ourselves, and they influence everything and everyone that we've coming to contact with. Some people don't like those words. So there's a book called The King, Magician, Lover, and the Warrior by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. It was written for men. It's about a man growing from the baby to a mature man in archetypes. Men like those words better because sometimes they don't like the saboteur and the prostitute, and a lot of people don't like the victim. So in the King, the Magician, and the Lover, the king is the child, the warrior is the victim, the magician is the saboteur, and the lover is the prostitute. And when we go over those archetypes later, you'll see how they work those in. But I just want to let you know there's more than one way to think of archetypes besides the system we're going to go with. But I wanted you to know that lots of people have different ways of setting it up. You're going to learn whichever way you decide to use in the long run, because really it's about learning about yourself in a way that you understand. These 4 archetypes represent a hero's journey, because when you're learning to get them to the light side, that's a hero's journey. It can be a short one, like in The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy's dream, or it can be a lifelong one, or it can be some trauma that happened to you. A hero's journey is where you face a series of obstacles and become the hero, even your own story. So I hope that helped you learn about archetypes. You can read pages 106 through 123 for more information. Our next class, which you'll get an email for next week, is called about the children. It's the child. We're going to go into depth in all the different children. The reason you're getting these emails a week apart is I want you to hear the video. You can read it, come back more than once if you need to. You can read the book. I want you to start letting that information soak into your subconscious and your conscious, or bring it out of your subconscious because it's already in your subconscious. So this is just a cute little audio I heard when I was looking up about the saboteur. I believe it's actually a video game, but I like how it starts out and the words in it that tells you kind of about the saboteur. So the finger points to you is the name of the particular song. There's a whole album about the saboteur. Remember, if you stay to the end of the class, you will be taken automatically to the blame video. So I hope you have a good week, and we'll get together next week. And here's the saboteur. Well, here we are in one big mess. It's much too late for an SOS. And if there's blame, I must confess. The finger points to you. We could have won so easily. The saddest part, it seems to me, is how you still refuse to see. The finger points to you. There's no shame inside you. There's no sense of wrong. If you were me, I know you'd be sitting here singing song. I can't believe I waste my time putting all my thoughts in right. You act like I can't understand. The finger points to you.